At 0200 hours, the sea was black and the U.S. Navy carrier group looked untouchable. A wall of radar destroyers, patrol jets, and layered defenses built to spot anything long before it got close. Then one British Buccaneer S.2 dropped to sea level and disappeared into the noise. No afterburner, no radio calls, just a fast, low shadow cutting through waves. By the time the radar picture caught up, the jet wasn't approaching anymore. It was already inside the screen, and the carrier group had seconds to react. At 0200 hours, the ocean was black and flat like glass. Somewhere out in the North Atlantic, a U.S. Navy carrier group moved through the darkness with the calm confidence of a force that believed it couldn't be surprised. A carrier at the center, escorts spread wide, radar coverage layered like armor, combat air patrols cycling overhead. Every ship and aircraft connected into one network designed for a single purpose: see first, react first, win first. To most people, that kind of defense sounds unbeatable. To the Royal Navy, it sounded like a challenge. Because the U.S. Navy's greatest strength, its radar and coordination, also came with one weakness that never went away, no matter how advanced the ships became: the ocean. The sea surface was not empty space. It was clutter. It was noise. It was a moving mirror that swallowed signals, bent returns, and hid small, fast shapes inside the chaos. Radar loved clean skies. But down low, near the waves, radar had to fight the planet itself. That's where the British had built something different. The Blackburn Buccaneer S.2 wasn't designed to win air shows or look elegant on posters. It was built to do one brutal job: fly fast, fly low, and put a strike exactly where it would hurt the most. It didn't climb high to be seen. It didn't sprint in loud to be feared. It hunted by becoming part of the sea on the flight deck of Ka. A British carrier, the Buccaneer sat ready under dim lights, painted in dull gray, shaped for speed and stability at low altitude. The crew moved around it without wasting motion. Final checks. Fuel confirmed. Stores secured. Systems aligned. No drama. No speeches. The pilot climbed in and sealed the canopy. Inside, the cockpit felt tight and quiet. The kind of quiet that only exists right before something violent begins. The engine note rose. The aircraft rolled forward. The catapult took it in one sudden snap of force, throwing the Buccaneer into the night like a weapon released from a hand. Within minutes, it was gone. Not climbing toward the stars, dropping toward the sea. The Buccaneer leveled out low, so low the horizon disappeared behind spray and darkness. The altitude wasn't measured in thousands of feet anymore. It was measured in how close the aircraft could stay to the waves without touching them. This wasn't flying. This was threading a needle at high speed in the dark. The U.S. Navy carrier group remained ahead, unaware, confident in its screen. The outer ring of ships swept the sky with radar. Patrol aircraft watched wide arcs. Everything looked normal on their displays. And that was the problem. Because the Buccaneer wasn't in the sky the way they expected. It wasn't a clean radar return coming from altitude. It was buried in the sea's reflection, hidden in the same noise that every fleet had to live with. A low, fast shadow cutting through water and wind. The pilot didn't speak. The jet didn't broadcast. The mission wasn't about communication. It was about timing. Because if the Buccaneer reached the carrier group before the radar picture caught up, the exercise wouldn't be about technology anymore. It would be about reaction speed. And in the dark, with the ocean masking the approach, the British jet was doing something the U.S. Navy hated most. It was making the carrier group late, not by outrunning the fleet, by outthinking the radar. And as the distance closed, the Buccaneer stayed low, steady, invisible, until the moment the American screen would finally realize something was wrong, and by then, it would already be too close. The Buccaneer stayed so low the sea felt like it was trying to grab the aircraft. At that altitude, there was no room for mistakes. One wrong input, one moment of overconfidence, and the jet wouldn't crash the way people imagine. It would simply vanish, swallowed by water before anyone could even call it in. But the Buccaneer S.2 was built for this. Its airframe was stable at speed, its controls were heavy but honest, and its pilots were trained to treat low-level flight like a weapon. Not reckless, not flashy. Precise. The British jet carved forward through darkness, riding the edge of the ocean's surface clutter. Every few seconds, the pilot checked instruments and heading, keeping the run clean and quiet. No radio calls, no lights, nothing that would give away the approach. Ahead, the U.S. Navy carrier group continued on its course, a moving fortress wrapped in layers of detection. Outer ring destroyers and cruisers scanning the sky. Inner escorts tightening around the carrier. Patrol aircraft above, watching wide arcs. On paper, nothing got through that. But paper didn't account for one ugly truth. Radar doesn't see perfectly near the sea. It sees reflections. It sees waves. It sees interference. And when something small and fast stays inside that noise, the picture becomes uncertain. Uncertainty is the first step to being late. Inside the carrier group's Combat Information Center, operators watched the scope as hundreds of returns drifted and shifted. Civilian traffic far away, weather clutter, faint anomalies that came and went. Everything looked routine. Then a faint return flickered. Not strong, not clean, just a weak contact appearing for a second, and disappearing again like it couldn't decide if it existed. The operator leaned in. It came back, then vanished. That was the moment where training and instinct collide. A young operator might ignore it. A good operator marks it. A great operator feels something in their gut that doesn't match the screen. Possible contact low, the operator said, careful and professional. Intermittent return. The tactical officer didn't panic. He didn't shout. He did what the U.S. Navy was trained to do. Recheck, correlate, confirm. But confirmation takes time, and time was the one thing the Buccaneer was stealing. The British jet continued forward, stable and ruthless, using the ocean itself as cover. It wasn't hiding behind stealth technology, it was hiding behind physics. At this range, the carrier group should have had minutes. They had seconds. The contact flickered again, stronger now, still low, still buried. The operator's voice sharpened. Contact is closing fast. Now the room moved differently. Chairs shifted, headsets tightened. The calm routine snapped into focus. Bring it up on all sensors. Radar operators adjusted filters. Surface search systems tried to pull it out of the clutter. The carrier group's network searched for a track it could trust. But the Buccaneer didn't give them a stable picture. It didn't climb. It didn't flare. It didn't do anything dramatic. It just stayed low and came in faster. A patrol jet overhead was redirected. A fighter was vectored toward the bearing. The carrier group started to turn slightly, not fleeing but shaping its defense, trying to buy space. That was the first sign they felt pressure, and pressure at sea spreads fast. Because once one ship reacts, the whole formation must react. One change in course forces another. One vector change forces another. The carrier group's perfect geometry began to stretch. The Buccaneer pilot watched it from the edge of the sea, reading the movement like a map. They'd seen him. But not clearly enough. Not early enough. The U.S. Navy had built a screen designed to stop high-altitude threats and predictable approaches. The Buccaneer was neither. And as the last miles closed, the British jet did the one thing that made the entire carrier group's radar picture collapse into urgency. It popped up, just slightly, not to be seen, to be locked, to mark the strike, and to prove that the carrier group wasn't untouchable. It was simply late. The Buccaneer rose just enough to separate itself from the sea's noise. Not a climb into the sky, not a dramatic pull-up, just a controlled increase in altitude, barely a few hundred feet, like a knife lifting out of water for the strike. And instantly, the radar picture snapped into clarity. The contact that had been flickering and disappearing now held steady, range, speed, heading, all clean, all undeniable. Inside the U.S. Navy carrier group, the response came fast. Track confirmed. High closure rate. Vector cap. A fighter overhead turned hard, dropping nose and accelerating toward the bearing. On the surface, escorts adjusted their spacing, tightening the formation around the carrier. The entire group shifted from routine posture to defensive posture in seconds. But the problem wasn't their speed, it was their timing. because the moment they confirmed the track was the moment they admitted something brutal. The threat was already inside the outer screen. That wasn't supposed to happen. The carrier group's defense was built in rings: detect far, classify early, engage outside. Every layer depended on the one before it doing its job. When a threat reached the inner ring before the fleet could shape the response, the whole system had to improvise. Improvisation is where mistakes live. The Buccaneer pilot didn't need to see the carrier yet. He didn't need to. His navigation was locked. His run was clean. The AI, the craft was stable, fast, and committed. The carrier group turned slightly again, trying to angle the wind across the deck, trying to position escorts for the best defensive arcs. The cap fighter dove lower, hunting for a visual. But at night, low over the sea, visual is a cruel word. The ocean swallowed contrast. The horizon was a lie, and the Buccaneer was painted in gray for a reason. The fighter pilot above scanned and scanned, searching for a shape that didn't belong. His radar had the track now, but radar at low altitude still played tricks. The return bounced. The angle shifted. The contact felt closer than it looked. Then the Buccaneer made the second move. It didn't run straight at the carrier like a missile. That would have been predictable. Instead, it slid sideways, just enough to change the approach angle and force the carrier group to resolve the problem. Small turn. Big consequences. Because now the escorts had to adjust again. The fighter had to correct again. The radar had to update again. And every correction cost a little time. The Buccaneer wasn't winning by being faster. It was winning by forcing them to keep recalculating. The carrier group's combat system tried to lock the threat into a clean engagement. But this wasn't a real war scenario where missiles would fire freely. This was an exercise, rules, boundaries, simulated weapons. Which meant the Buccaneer's real weapon wasn't a bomb. It was a clock. The pilot held the jet low and fast, closing the last miles with a steady hand. The carrier group's defensive posture was now fully awake, but it was awake too late. The Buccaneer broke through the final ring. At this distance, the carrier itself finally became visible, just a darker shape against darker water, lights faint, deck line barely readable in the night, a floating city wrapped in steel, and the British jet was already in the best possible position, a simulated attack run, a clean line, a perfect release point. The Buccaneer systems marked it automatically. The pilot didn't need to guess. The aircraft was designed to deliver strikes with brutal accuracy. He held the nose steady, counted the seconds, and called it. Simulated release. That was it. No explosion, no fireball. But the message hit harder than a real weapon. Because in the exercise world, that call meant the carrier had been struck. The mission had been completed. The defense had been penetrated. And now the U.S. Navy had to face the one outcome it hated more than losing a fight. They had to face being surprised. The cap fighter finally got a glimpse. Just a flash of shape and motion skimming low over the water. The pilot turned hard, trying to pursue, but the Buccaneer didn't stay to celebrate. It dropped back into the sea clutter immediately, vanishing again into the noise it had used to get in. The carrier group had reacted. The carrier group had moved. The carrier group had tried, but the Buccaneer had already proven the point. It wasn't that U.S. Navy radar was weak. It was strong. It was advanced. It was layered. But against a jet built to live at sea level, timing mattered more than technology. And for one night run, the British strike jet had done something no one liked to admit was possible. It made the carrier group late. The moment the Buccaneer dropped back into the sea clutter, the fight changed again. Because now it wasn't about stopping the strike. The strike had already happened. Now it was about pride, control, and the one thing every carrier group demanded at all times. Restore the screen. Reset the order. On the carrier, the deck continued its rhythm like nothing had changed. Lights, crews, aircraft cycling, because that's what a fleet does. It keeps moving. It keeps working. Even when something uncomfortable just happened inside the defense net. But inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere wasn't routine anymore. The replay began instant. Replay operators ran the timeline back, contacts, bearings, intermittent returns, the exact second the track first flickered, the moment it stabilized. the moment it was already too close. No one shouted. That's not how professionals react. They get quieter. They get sharper. They start asking questions that cut deep. How long was it in the clutter? Why didn't we hold the track? Where did the cap lose the picture? How did it get inside the outer ring? And the answer wasn't a single mistake. That was the worst part. It wasn't one operator failing. It wasn't one radar breaking. It wasn't one pilot being slow. It was a chain of tiny realities stacking together until the result became unavoidable. Sea clutter, night conditions, low altitude, high closure speed. A jet designed for exactly this. The Buccaneer had used the environment like a weapon, and the carrier group had been forced to admit something it never liked to admit. Not everything can be solved early. Sometimes the first clean picture comes too late. Far out over the ocean, the Buccaneer stayed low for miles, then finally climbed into safer air once the threat window passed. The pilot's breathing remained steady. No victory call, no dramatic radio line, just calm professionalism. Because to the British, this wasn't about embarrassing anyone. It was about proving a concept. A carrier group could be powerful and still be vulnerable to the right profile at the wrong time. Back on the American side, the fleet adjusted. Cap patterns shifted. Filters were changed. Radar operators altered settings to better handle low returns. The outer ring spacing was reconsidered. Helicopters were brought into the picture for surface-level scanning. All small changes, but they mattered. Because naval warfare isn't just missiles and steel, it's learning, it's adaptation, it's turning discomfort into doctrine. The exercise ended without drama. Ships stayed in formation, aircraft recovered, the sea remained the same cold black surface it had been all night. But the lesson stayed behind like a scar. The British Buccaneer S.2 didn't win a war. It didn't destroy a fleet. It didn't prove the U.S. Navy was weak. It proved something far more dangerous. Even the strongest defense becomes slow when it has to solve uncertainty at the last moment. And uncertainty lives where the sea meets the sky, in the low band, in the clutter, in the place the Buccaneer was built to own. Later, in briefings, the story would get repeated the way stories always do, each retelling sharper, heavier, more dramatic. Some would call it an outplay, some would call it a surprise, some would call it luck. But the professionals in the room knew the truth. It wasn't luck. It was design meeting discipline. A jet built to strike ships. A pilot trained to trust the low-level run. And a carrier group reminded that no matter how advanced the radar was, it still had to fight the ocean.